The bank manager's face didn't just turn pale, it went the color of a fresh shroud. I watched, paralyzed, as his hands began a frantic, rhythmic trembling, the kind of shake you only see in people who have just looked directly into the sun. He didn't look at me like a customer anymore. He looked at me like I had just walked into his pristine, marble-floored lobby and handed him a live grenade with the pin pulled out. His voice, when he finally found it, was a jagged whisper directed at his assistant. He told her to lock the front doors. Not just the vault, the front doors. He told her to call the police, and he didn't even try to hide the panic in his eyes. All of this because of a small, weathered leather book. My dead grandfather's old passbook. The same one my mother had tossed into the kitchen trash just 24 hours ago, calling it worthless junk that should have stayed buried with the man who owned it. She was so certain it meant nothing. She was so sure the secrets of Eugene Gross were as dead as his heartbeat. But as I sat in that high-backed leather chair, watching the security guards stiffen and the manager's knuckles turn white, I realized that some secrets refuse to stay in the grave. And some of them have teeth. My name is Danica Gross. I'm 31 years old, and until yesterday, the most stressful part of my existence was arguing with a landlord who thought a leaking radiator was a water feature. I work as a paralegal in a small, dusty law firm in Columbus, Ohio. It's not the kind of job they make television shows about. The pay is modest, the coffee is always burnt, and my car is a 12-year-old sedan that sounds like a dying whale every time I dare to make a left turn. But I'm good at what I do for one specific reason. I notice things. I'm the person who reads the fine print in a 30-page contract. I'm the one who notices when a signature looks just a fraction of a millimeter off. I ask the questions that make people uncomfortable, and I don't let go until the math adds up. My family has always called this a character flaw. They call me difficult, they call me cynical, but standing in the wreckage of my grandfather's life, I was starting to think that noticing things was the only thing that was going to keep me alive. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, a day as gray and indifferent as the ceremony itself. My grandfather, Eugene Gross, had passed away at 89. He was a man of quiet habits and even quieter words. He lived on a modest farm 2 hours outside the city, a place of wraparound porches and fields that seemed to stretch into the forever. To the world, he was just an old man in an old house, a retired accountant living out his final years in a simplicity that bordered on poverty. That was the version of the story my mother, Miriam, wanted everyone to swallow. She organized the funeral with the cold, sterile efficiency of a corporate merger. 30 minutes for the service, 45 minutes for the reception, and then everyone was expected to vanish. No lingering over memories, no unnecessary tears. Miriam treats emotions like a form of financial waste, something to be managed, minimized, and eventually eliminated. Even the catering felt like an insult. It was the kind of food where mayonnaise was treated as a primary food group. I stood there, watching my brother Wyatt arrive 40 minutes late, adjusted his $3,000 suit, and complained about the parking. We were at a farmhouse with a gravel lot the size of a football field, but Wyatt lived in a world where his inconveniences were the only things that mattered. He didn't look sad. He looked like a man waiting for a meeting to end so he could check his stock portfolio. I stood in the corner, a stranger to my own blood, watching them perform grief like a badly rehearsed stage play. I thought about the real Eugene Gross. He was an accountant for 4 decades. He didn't just understand numbers, he spoke them. He could look at a ledger and see the hidden stories, the crimes, the triumphs, and the lies that everyone else missed. He was also the man who taught me how to play chess when I was 7 years old. We would sit on that porch in the suffocating summer heat, the board between us, and he would tell me that chess wasn't about the pieces you captured. It was about the positions you created. It was about the traps you set and the divine patience required to wait for your opponent to make the mistake they didn't even know they were making. He had a favorite saying, "The truth is patient, Danica. It can wait much longer than any lie." I never understood it back then. I thought it was just the rambling of an old man who spent too much time with his head in a book. 2 weeks before he died, I visited him one last time. He was frail, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were still those of a grandmaster, sharp, focused, and terrifyingly alive. He grabbed my hand with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a dying man and pulled me close. His breath smelled of peppermint and age. He whispered only a few words, but he made me promise. "The passbook," he said. "The chess book. Only you, Danica. Promise me." I promised, not because I understood, but because it was the last thing he would ever ask of me. And so, after the funeral, while Miriam was already measuring the walls of the farmhouse for a quick sale, and Wyatt was calculating the timber value of the trees out back, I slipped away. I went to his study, a room that still held the ghost of his pipe tobacco, and I found it. Strategic Endgame, a master's guide. It was his favorite book. But when I pulled it from the shelf, it was too heavy. The pages had been hollowed out with surgical precision. Inside sat that leather passbook, looking like a relic from the 1950s. When I brought it into the living room, thinking my family would be curious, the air in the room curdled. Miriam didn't ask questions. She didn't wonder what was inside. She reacted with a sharp, violent instinct. She snatched it from my hands and, without even opening it, threw it into the trash can. She told me it was garbage. She told me to stop digging through things that didn't belong to me. She and Wyatt exchanged a look, a brief, microscopic flash of shared understanding that I recognized instantly from my years at the law firm. It was the look of two people who knew exactly where the bodies were buried and were suddenly realized someone was holding a shovel. That was the moment I knew. My mother wasn't angry because I was being sentimental. She was terrified. And if a woman like Miriam Gross was afraid of an old piece of leather, then I needed to know exactly what was written on those pages. The drive back to the farmhouse in the pre-dawn darkness felt like a descent into another world. The city lights of Columbus faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by the oppressive, ink-black silence of the Ohio countryside. I kept the radio off. I needed the silence to sharpen my thoughts. My grandfather, Eugene Gross, was a man of absolute patterns. He was a man who categorized his socks by thread count and his library by the Dewey Decimal System. He did not leave cryptic clues for the sake of drama. He was far too practical for that. If he had hidden that passbook in a hollowed-out book and made me promise to find it, it wasn't a game. It was an insurance policy. And my mother's reaction, that swift, aggressive disposal of the book, was the confirmation. You don't throw away worthless junk with that much venom. You throw away evidence. You throw away the things that can hurt you. I arrived at the farmhouse just as the horizon began to bleed a pale, bruised purple. The old wooden structure sat there, skeletal and lonely, looking more like a monument than a home. I let myself in with the spare key he always kept under the third porch step, a secret he'd shared with me when I was 10, a secret I realized my mother and brother likely didn't even know existed. The house smelled of stale air and the lingering floral scent of the funeral flowers that were already beginning to rot. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to signal my presence to any watchful neighbors or, worse, a passing patrol car. Instead, I used the flashlight on my phone, the beam cutting a lonely path through the shadows of the hallway. I reached the kitchen and stopped. The trash can was right where it had been the night before. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold prickle at the back of my neck. I pulled the plastic bag out and set it on the linoleum floor. There I was, a woman with a master's degree and a career in law, kneeling in the dirt, elbow deep in coffee grounds, soggy paper napkins, and the discarded remains of a funeral reception. I felt like a raccoon in business casual, scavenging through the debris of a dead man's life. My therapist would have had a field day with the symbolism, but my grandfather, the man who valued the position over the peace, would have nodded in grim approval. He knew that to find the truth, you often had to get your hands dirty. Near the very bottom, tucked under a layer of wet potato salad and discarded envelopes, I felt the cold, stiff texture of leather. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled it out, wiping the grime away with the sleeve of my coat, not caring about the stain. I sat there on the kitchen floor, the flashlight beam trembling slightly as I opened the cover. The passbook looked ancient, the kind of thing used by banks in the early 20th century. But as I flipped through the pages, the professional in me took over. I noticed the discrepancies immediately. The paper quality was too high for the era it was mimicking, the ink wasn't faded, and the account number, 774122289, didn't follow the old-fashioned ledger format. It was long, modern, and looked more like an international routing code than a local savings account from a rural bank. Then, I found it. Tucked deep into the binding, folded into a square so small it was almost invisible, was a sliver of translucent onion skin paper. I unfolded it with shaking fingers. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eugene's precise architectural script. It said, "Account number 77412289. They don't know about this one. Ask for the full history. Trust no one in the family. Only you, Danica." The words, "trust no one," were underlined twice, the pen pressing so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through. My grandfather hadn't just been hiding money. He had been hiding a legacy from his own children. He had been protecting something, or someone, from Miriam and Wyatt. I took out my phone and began photographing every single page, every smudge of ink, and the note itself. Working at a law firm teaches you one thing above all else. Physical evidence is fragile. It can be burned, shredded, or lost in transit. But digital data, once mirrored to the cloud, is a ghost that cannot be exorcised. I uploaded the images to 3 different secure servers before I even stood up. I felt a strange sense of fortification. I was no longer just a grieving granddaughter. I was an investigator with a lead. The drive back to the city was a blur of calculated risks. I kept checking my mirrors, wondering if Miriam's maternal instinct would lead her back to the farmhouse to check the trash. My mother was many things, but she wasn't stupid. She was a predator who understood the value of a clean kill. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was fully up, casting long, harsh shadows across the brick buildings of Columbus. I barely had time to wash the smell of the trash from my hands before my phone vibrated on the counter. It was Miriam. Her voice, when I answered, was jarringly sweet. It was that performative, concerned mother tone she used when she wanted information. "Just checking on you, Danica," she said, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "Yesterday was so taxing for all of us. I wanted to make sure you got home okay." I felt a chill. Miriam hadn't called to check on my well-being in over a decade. I lied smoothly, a skill I'd honed by watching her for 30 years. I told her I was just tired, still processing everything. "You didn't take anything else from the house, did you?" she asked, the sweetness dropping an octave into something sharper. "I need to catalog everything for the estate. The lawyers are very particular about the inventory." "Just the chessbook," I replied, my voice steady. "For the memories." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so heavy I could almost hear her brain gears grinding. She was deciding whether to believe me or to push. "Good," she finally said. "That's fine. But Danica, don't go digging through his things anymore. Your grandfather wasn't well at the end. His mind was fractured. He grew paranoid. He imagined things that weren't there. Some things are better left in the past." I hung up, my heart racing. She was laying the groundwork. She was painting him as a senile old man to discredit anything I might find. But 2 weeks ago, that senile man had looked at me with the clarity of a diamond and told me exactly where to look. He wasn't the one who was fractured. He was the one who had finally seen the whole picture. And as I looked at the passbook sitting on my coffee table, I realized that if I wanted to know why the bank manager would eventually turn white with fear, I had to stop being the granddaughter and start being the accountant's student. I had to look for the story the numbers were trying to tell. By 7 o'clock that evening, the second shoe dropped. My brother Wyatt called. Now, in the ecosystem of the Gross family, Wyatt calling me for a chat was about as natural as a shark offering to walk your dog. The last time he'd reached out voluntarily was 3 years ago, and that was only to ask if I still had our father's old gold-plated golf clubs. I did. He took them. I never saw them, or him, again until the funeral. Wyatt was the golden boy, the one who lived in a world of high interest rates and low-interest empathy. When I saw his name flash on my screen, I knew the perimeter was closing in. Miriam had clearly briefed him. "Hey, Danny," he said, using the nickname I'd told him I hated since the 3rd grade. His voice was smooth, practiced, the sound of a man who spent his life convincing people to invest in things they didn't need. Mom mentioned you were feeling a bit sentimental at the farmhouse. Just wanted to check in. It's a lot to process, losing the old man. I'm handling it, Wyatt, I said, leaning back against my kitchen counter, eyes fixed on the passbook. Just taking it one day at a time. Right. Look, the reason I'm calling is that Mom and I have been talking about the logistics. The farmhouse, the land. It's a mess, legally speaking. Grandpa didn't exactly keep things up to date. I'm going to handle the property sale to save you the headache. Mom's taking over the liquid assets and the estate accounting. You don't need to worry about a thing. Just focus on your work at the firm. It was a masterclass in domestic gaslighting. They weren't just excluding me. They were trying to erase my standing before I even realized there was a floor to stand on. Miriam gets the cash, Wyatt gets the land, and Danica gets a pat on the head and a don't worry about it. They assumed I would be the same quiet, observant girl I'd always been, the one who watched from the corner and didn't make waves. They forgot that the girl in the corner was the only one who had actually been paying attention to the man who built the house. "That's very generous of you both," I lied, my voice as flat as I could make it. "I'll stay out of your hair." "Atta girl," he said, and I could practically hear the smirk through the phone. "Just let it go, Danny. You know how Mom gets when she's on a mission. It's not worth the fight." After I hung up, the silence in my apartment felt heavy, charged with the electricity of their lies. 9 hours apart. Miriam calls in the morning to set the "he was crazy" narrative, and Wyatt calls in the evening to seal the "we've got it covered" coffin. They were coordinating. They were scared. And more importantly, they were desperate to keep me away from a dead man's paper trail. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best. I went down the rabbit hole. I opened my laptop and began researching the bank listed on the inside cover of the passbook. It wasn't one of the big national chains with a branch on every corner. It was Heritage Trust and Mercantile, a private institution that had been absorbed by a larger regional bank in the late 90s, which was then swallowed by an international conglomerate a decade later. This was why the account number looked modern. The passbook itself was a shell, a physical placeholder, but the account it represented had been migrated through 3 different banking mergers. If my grandfather was as careful as I knew him to be, he hadn't just left me a savings account with a few $1,000s. An accountant who hides a ledger in a hollowed-out book isn't hiding a rainy day fund. He's hiding a paper trail. I started looking into the history of Heritage Trust and Mercantile. In the mid-'80s, they were involved in a massive federal investigation regarding offshore shell companies and ghost accounts, funds that existed on paper but had no clear origin. The investigation had been dropped due to a lack of evidence and the accidental destruction of several key ledgers during a warehouse fire. My grandfather had been the senior auditor for that bank during that exact period. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Eugene Gross wasn't just an accountant for a quiet rural bank. He was the man who held the keys to the vault. If there were ghost accounts, he was the one who would have found them. And if he had found them and kept the evidence, he wouldn't have just been an auditor anymore. He would have been a witness. Or a target. I looked back at the note. Ask for the full history. Trust no one. He wasn't telling me to go withdraw his pension. He was telling me to pull the thread that would unravel 30 years of family secrets. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, clutching that passbook like it was a shield. I knew that the moment I walked into that bank the next morning, my life as Danica Gross, the quiet paralegal, was over. I was stepping onto the chessboard, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't playing against a stranger. I was playing against my mother. The next morning, I dressed in my best suit, the one I usually reserved for court hearings. I needed to look like someone who understood the law, not someone who had been digging through trash cans 24 hours earlier. I drove to the main branch of the Successor Bank, a glass and steel monolith in downtown Columbus. The air inside was chilled, smelling of expensive carpet and sterile efficiency. I walked up to the teller and didn't ask for a balance inquiry. I asked for the branch manager. When she asked why, I simply held up the passbook. She frowned, looking at the old leather cover with a mixture of confusion and amusement. "We haven't used those in 30 years, she said. "I know," I replied. "That's why I need to speak to the manager. This account has a legacy status. It's flagged for manual review. I didn't actually know if it was flagged, but it was a calculated gamble. If my grandfather wanted me to ask for the full history, there had to be a reason the history wasn't available at a standard terminal. 10 minutes later, I was being led into a private office. The man behind the desk was named Mr. Henderson. He was mid-50s, with a tired face and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many divorces and bankruptcies. "How can I help you, Ms. Gross?" he asked, glancing at the passbook on his desk. "I'm the executor of my grandfather's private effects," I said, stretching the truth just enough to sound official. "I need the full transaction history for account 77412289, dating back to its inception at Heritage Trust." He sighed, pulling his keyboard closer. "Legacy accounts from the Heritage era are archived on a separate server. It'll take a moment to pull the records." He started typing, his expression bored, indifferent. He was just a man doing a job, waiting for his lunch break. Then, the screen flickered. Henderson stopped typing. He squinted at the monitor. He hit a key, then another. He leaned in closer, his brow furrowing. I watched his face. The boredom evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. He clicked the mouse rapidly, his breath hitching in his chest. "Is there a problem?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He didn't respond. He looked at the screen, then looked at me, then looked back at the screen. His face began to lose its color, the pinkness of his cheeks fading into a sickly, translucent white. He stood up so quickly his chair hit the wall behind him with a dull thud. His hands, resting on the mahogany desk, began to tremble. "Ms. Gross," he whispered, his voice cracking. I need you to stay right here. I have to make a phone call." "Who are you calling, Mr. Henderson?" He didn't answer. He turned to his assistant, who was standing by the door. "Lock the front doors," he said, his voice rising in a panic he couldn't control. "Lock them now, and call the police. Tell them we have a Code Black event in progress." He looked at me then, and the look in his eyes wasn't one of professional concern. It was pure, unadulterated terror. It was the look of a man who had just realized he wasn't looking at a bank account. He was looking at a crime scene that had been hidden for 30 years. The sound of the heavy glass doors clicking shut echoed through the lobby like a gunshot. It was a cold, mechanical sound that signaled the end of my life as a private citizen and the beginning of something far more dangerous. Outside, the midday traffic of Columbus continued to flow, oblivious to the fact that inside this sterile temple of finance, the oxygen had suddenly become very thin. Mr. Henderson was no longer looking at me. He was looking through me, his eyes darting toward the security cameras as if he expected them to grow limbs and seize him. The assistant, a young woman who had looked bored only seconds ago, was now fumbling with her desk phone, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "Code Black?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible, though my heart was performing a frantic staccato against my ribs. "Mr. Henderson, I'm a paralegal. I know the Banking Privacy Acts. You can't just lock me in here without cause. What did you see on that screen?" Henderson didn't answer. He was staring at the monitor as if it were a portal to hell. He reached out and turned the screen away from me, a reflexive movement of concealment. But I had seen enough in those final seconds. I had seen a balance, a number so long it didn't seem real, followed by a series of red-flagged alerts that were flashing in a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse. My grandfather had been a humble accountant on a small farm. He drove an old truck and wore flannel shirts with holes in the elbows. There was no world in which he should have had an account that triggered a Code Black protocol at a major financial institution. "I need to speak to my lawyer," I said, reaching for my bag. "Don't," Henderson snapped. It was the first time he'd shown any steel, but it was born of desperation, not authority. "Ms. Gross, you don't understand. This account, it shouldn't exist. It was flagged as extinguished by the Federal Treasury in 1992. The fact that it's active and that you have the physical passbook linked to the master key, it's not just a banking error, it's a systemic breach." He was trembling so hard now that he had to sit back down. He grabbed a glass of water, but his hand shook so violently that he splashed it across his desk. I watched the water soak into a pile of loan applications, and all I could think about was my grandfather's voice. The truth is patient. He had waited 30 years for this moment. He had waited until he was gone, until the pieces were in their final positions to trigger this trap. But who was the trap for? Was it for the bank? Or was it for the family he told me not to trust? Within minutes, the sirens began. They weren't the distant, fading wails you hear in the city. They were loud, aggressive, and they were stopping right outside. 2 cruisers pulled onto the sidewalk, followed by a black SUV with tinted windows. This wasn't a standard response to a bank robbery. This was something else. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I thought about Miriam and Wyatt. I thought about their coordinated phone calls, their insistence that I let it go. Did they know about the code black? Were they part of the reason the Treasury had tried to extinguish this account 30 years ago? The door to the office burst open. 2 men in dark suits, not police uniforms, stepped in. They didn't look like bank security. They had the clipped, professional air of federal agents, or people who wanted to be mistaken for them. The taller one, a man with salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite, looked at Henderson, then at me, then at the passbook sitting on the desk. "I'm Special Agent Vance," he said, though he didn't produce a badge. "Mr. Henderson, leave the room. Take your assistant and go to the break room. Do not use your phones. Do not speak to the press. This is now a matter of national financial security." Henderson didn't argue. He practically ran out of the room, leaving me alone with the 2 men. Vance sat in the manager's chair and pulled the passbook toward him with a gloved hand. He flipped through it slowly, his expression unreadable. The other man stood by the door, his arms crossed, blocking my only exit. "Danica Gross," Vance said, his voice a low melodic rumble. "Daughter of Miriam Gross, granddaughter of Eugene Gross. You've caused quite a stir today, Danica. Do you have any idea what this is?" He tapped the passbook. "It's my grandfather's property," I said, leaning on my legal training like a crutch. "And unless you're charging me with a crime, I'd like to leave with it." Vance laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Property? This isn't property. This is a map. Your grandfather wasn't just an accountant, Danica. He was the chief record keeper for a consortium that didn't exist on any official books. For 40 years, he moved money for people who make presidents look like pawns. And in 1991, when the consortium tried to liquidate their assets, your grandfather did something very brave or very stupid. He stole the ledger." "He didn't steal anything," I defended, though my voice lacked conviction. "He lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. He had nothing." "He had everything," Vance corrected. "He just didn't spend it. He kept it in this account, shielded by a series of cryptographic loops that he designed himself. We've been looking for this ghost ledger for 3 decades. We thought it was destroyed in the Heritage Trust fire. We thought Eugene died taking the location to his grave." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "But he didn't, did he? He gave it to you. And now, the people he stole it from, the people your mother and brother have been working for, know you have it." The room seemed to tilt. The people my mother and brother have been working for? My mind raced back to Wyatt's $3,000 suit, his investments, and Miriam's cold, calculated management of the estate. They weren't just greedy. They were employees. They were looking for the ledger because they were under orders. My grandfather hadn't been protecting me from my family's greed. He had been protecting me from their complicity in something much darker. "Where is the rest of it, Danica?" Vance asked. "The passbook is just the key. It opens the door, but it doesn't contain the data. There's a second part, a physical drive or a secondary set of codes. Eugene told you where it is, didn't he?" I thought about the chessbook, strategic endgame. I thought about the hollowed-out pages. I hadn't looked at the book itself closely enough. I'd only grabbed the passbook. But I wasn't going to tell Vance that. Not until I knew whose side he was really on. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. Vance sighed and stood up. He looked at his partner by the door. "She's lying, but she's scared. Take her to the holding facility. We'll let her mother talk to her. Maybe Miriam can succeed where we can't." As they grabbed my arms to lead me out, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. I managed to sneak a glance at the screen as they pulled me through the lobby, past the locked doors and the silent, staring bank tellers. The message read, The queen is guarded, but the night is free. Check the porch. Don't go home. They are already there. It was my grandfather's voice, or at least, it was his language. He was still playing the game, even from the grave, and the next move was mine. The weight of the special agents on my arms felt less like a rescue and more like an arrest. As they marched me through the bank's lobby, the air felt thick with the scent of a trap closing. The message on my phone, "The queen is guarded, but the night is free," was a jolt of pure electricity. It was Grandpa's chess shorthand. In his world, the queen was Miriam, powerful, dangerous, but restricted by her own ambitions. The night? That was me. The piece that moves in ways no one expects, leaping over obstacles that stop everyone else. But the warning at the end of the text sent a chill down my spine that was colder than the bank's air conditioning. Don't go home. They are already there. Vance and his partner were leading me toward the black SUV. I knew that if I got into that vehicle, I was disappearing. I wouldn't be going to a police station. I'd be going to a holding facility where my rights as a paralegal would mean nothing, and my mother's persuasion would mean everything. I had to move now. I had to use the night's L-shaped jump. "Wait!" I stumbled, making my knees go weak. "My bag! The passbook is still on the desk!" Vance hesitated. He looked back toward the manager's office. That split second of greed, the desire to secure the physical key, was his mistake. He signaled his partner to stay with me and turned back. As soon as his back was turned, I didn't fight the man holding my arm. I leaned into him, hard. I used the weight of my heavy leather tote bag like a flail, swinging it with every ounce of terror and adrenaline I had left. The corner of the bag, filled with my laptop and legal files, caught him square in the temple. He didn't fall, but he staggered, his grip loosening just enough. I didn't run for the front doors. They were locked. I ran for the teller line. I knew this branch layout from a title search I'd done months ago. There was a service entrance through the break room that led to the secure parking garage. I vaulted over the counter, ignoring the screams of the tellers, and dove through the swinging door. "Stop her!" Vance's voice roared from the office. I burst into the break room. Mr. Henderson and his assistant were there, huddling in fear. I didn't stop to explain. I hit the emergency fire exit. The alarm began to wail, a piercing, soul-crushing shriek that filled the building. In a bank, a fire alarm triggers an automatic unlock of all perimeter doors for safety regulations. It was a gamble. Most high-security banks have a delay, but as I slammed my weight against the garage door, it gave way. I burst into the sunlight of the parking garage, my lungs burning. I didn't go for my whale-sounding car. They would have the plates on camera within seconds. Instead, I saw a delivery bike leaning against a concrete pillar, the courier inside the building making a drop-off. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I hopped on, pedaling with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed, weaving between the luxury cars and exiting through the in lane just as the black SUV roared around the corner to intercept the main exit. I didn't stop until I was 6 blocks away, hidden in the narrow, trash-strewn alley of a gentrifying district. My heart was a drum, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I ditched the bike behind a dumpster and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Check the porch. Grandpa's instruction was specific. Not the house, the porch. I thought about the farmhouse, the third step where the key stayed, the wraparound wood that had seen 100 games of chess. There was something else there. Something I had missed because I was looking for books and ledgers. I was looking for an accountant's secrets, but I should have been looking for a carpenter's. I couldn't use my car, and I couldn't go home. I ducked into a nearby pharmacy and bought a cheap pair of sunglasses and a baseball cap, pulling my hair into a tight bun. I looked like every other stressed-out woman in Columbus. I used a ride-sharing app on a burner phone I kept in my emergency kit, paralegal paranoia finally paying off, and requested a trip to a town 3 miles south of the farmhouse. I couldn't risk a direct route. As the car moved through the Ohio suburbs, I checked the news on my phone. Nothing. Not a word about a bank lockdown or a code black. The silence was more terrifying than a headline. It meant the people Vance worked for had total control over the narrative. They were scrubbing the scene while they hunted me. I spent the 2-hour drive analyzing the text message. Who sent it? Grandpa was dead. I had seen the casket. I had seen the dirt fall. But Eugene Gross was a master of the long game. He knew how to automate. He knew how to set things in motion that would trigger long after he left the board. It was a scheduled message, likely set to go off if a certain account was accessed or if a specific person didn't check in. I was dropped off at a dusty gas station and walked the remaining miles through the fields, staying low in the tall grass. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the setting sun. It looked different now. It didn't look like a place of memories. It looked like a fortress. And as I got closer, I saw the flickering of lights inside. Someone was already there. I crept toward the porch, my stomach churning. Through the tall windows of the living room, I saw them. Miriam was standing by the fireplace, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. She looked frustrated, her usual mask of composure slipping. Wyatt was pacing, his expensive suit jacket tossed onto the sofa. He was shouting, though I couldn't hear the words through the heavy glass. He was pointing toward the study. They were looking for the second part. The master key Vance had mentioned. They knew the passbook I'd taken wasn't enough. I stayed in the shadows of the porch, crawling on my hands and knees toward the far end, away from the windows. Check the porch. I remembered Grandpa fixing the floorboards 3 years ago. He had spent weeks on it, claiming the wood was rotting. But Eugene Gross never did manual labor unless there was a hidden objective. I reached the corner where we used to play. I felt along the underside of the heavy oak railing. Nothing. I moved to the floorboards, pressing down on each one. Then I heard it. A hollow, metallic clack. Underneath the spot where my chair used to sit, one of the boards wasn't nailed down. It was held by a magnetic latch. I pried it up with a broken twig, and my breath caught. Tucked into a waterproof metal box was a small, high-density flash drive and a second passbook. This one was black, not brown. But as my fingers closed around the box, a shadow fell over me. "I always told your father you were too much like him, Danica," a voice said. I froze. I looked up. Standing at the edge of the porch, silhouetted by the rising moon, was Miriam. She wasn't holding a phone anymore. She was holding a small silver pistol, and for the first time in my life, she was looking at me with something that looked remarkably like respect. "The nights move," she whispered, her voice cold and devoid of maternal warmth. "Very clever. Now, give me the box, or we find out if the truth is as patient as a bullet." The barrel of the silver pistol didn't waver. In the moonlight, my mother looked less like a grieving daughter and more like a statue carved from ice. This was the woman who had tucked me into bed, who had packed my school lunches, and who was now prepared to end my life over a waterproof metal box. The betrayal should have hurt, but standing there in the dirt, clutching the secret my grandfather had died to protect, I felt only a strange, clarifying coldness. The mask was finally off. This was the real Miriam Gross, the woman Eugene had tried to warn me about. "You won't pull the trigger, Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. "A gunshot in the middle of a quiet country night? The neighbors are miles away, but sound travels. And you've always hated a mess. A mess is hard to manage. A mess leaves a paper trail." Miriam smiled, a thin, jagged line that didn't reach her eyes. "You've spent too much time in law offices, Danica. You think the world runs on rules and evidence. But the people I work for? They own the ink that writes the rules. A tragic accident involving a distraught granddaughter and a farm tool is very easy to arrange. Wyatt is already inside preparing the narrative. Now, the box. I won't ask a third time." I looked down at the metal box in my hand. If I gave it to her, I was dead anyway. Once she had the master key, I was a loose end, the only person who knew the truth about Eugene's ghost accounts. My only leverage was the data itself. "Vance is looking for you," I said, stalling for time as I scanned the porch for an opening. "The bank is in lockdown. He knows about the Heritage Trust accounts. He knows about the consortium. If you kill me, you're just handing him the only person who can navigate Grandpa's encryption." Miriam laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Vance? You think Vance is the opposition? Danica, Vance is on the payroll. He wasn't trying to arrest you. He was trying to secure you before the others did. There are two sides to this war, and your grandfather was the only one who knew how to play both. He was a double agent for 30 years, moving money for the cartels while feeding data to the feds, all while skimming enough off the top to build an empire that doesn't exist on any map. The revelation felt like the floor dropping out from under me. Grandpa wasn't just a brave whistleblower, he was a master manipulator. He had played the most dangerous game in the world and won, and I was the final piece he had moved into position. If he was so powerful, why did he die in a drafty farmhouse with holes in his elbows? I asked. Because he knew that the only way to keep the money was to never spend it, she snapped. He was a miser of secrets. He loved the power of the numbers more than the luxury they could buy. But Wyatt and I? We don't share his ascetic tastes. We want what is owed to us for 30 years of playing the part of the dutiful, ignored children. Inside the house, I heard a heavy thud, followed by Wyatt's voice raised in a panicked shout. Miriam's eyes flickered toward the window for a fraction of a second. That was my opening. I didn't run away from her. I lunged forward, swinging the metal box toward her wrist. The heavy steel hit the bone with a sickening crack. The pistol clattered to the wooden porch floor. Miriam let out a strangled gasp of pain, reaching for her arm, but I didn't wait to see if she would recover. I grabbed the gun, not to use it, but to keep it from her, and I sprinted toward the back of the property, toward the dark, sprawling silhouette of the cornfields. "Wyatt!" Miriam screamed, her voice shrill with rage. "She has it! Get her!" I hit the edge of the field, the tall, dry stalks of corn slapping against my face like 1,000 tiny hands. I ran blindly, guided only by the moon and the instinct to survive. Behind me, I could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of Wyatt's expensive Italian shoes hitting the dirt. He was younger, faster, and driven by a lifetime of resentment. "Danny, stop!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the stalks. "You don't know what you're holding. That drive contains the names of every judge, politician, and CEO that Grandpa was laundering for. You think you're a hero? You're a walking dead woman. Give it to me and I can negotiate a way out for you." I didn't believe him for a second. Wyatt would sell my soul for a 5% return on investment. I kept running until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I reached a clearing near the old irrigation pond, the water still and black as oil. I stopped, crouching low, trying to quiet my breathing. I opened the metal box. Inside, the black passbook wasn't a ledger. It was a diary. The first page was dated June 14, 1994. "They think they own the silence," the entry began in Grandpa's familiar script. "But silence is like a debt. Eventually, the interest becomes too high to pay." Miriam has begun asking about the heritage accounts. She has the ambition of a queen but the soul of a vulture. I cannot leave the truth to her. I will leave it to the one who knows how to watch the board. There was a second item in the box, a small silver key with a tag that simply read, "The King's Row." Suddenly, the cornstalks parted. Wyatt stepped into the clearing, his face drenched in sweat, his eyes wild. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore, and his shirt was torn. He looked like the predator he had always been beneath the polish. He saw the black book in my hand and stopped. "The diary," he whispered, his voice shaking. "He kept a record? All the names? All the dates?" "Everything, Wyatt," I said, holding the book over the dark water of the pond. "Every bribe you helped him facilitate during your summer internships, every shell company Miriam set up while she was traveling for business, it's all here." "Give it to me, Danica," he said, taking a slow, predatory step forward. "If that gets out, we all go down. You too. You're a gross. You think the feds will believe you weren't in on it? You work at a law firm. You know how conspiracy to commit works. They'll bury you in a cell next to us." "I'd rather be in a cell than in your shoes, Wyatt." He lunged. I threw the book, not into the water, but high into the air, back toward the corn. As he instinctively turned to track it, I didn't run. I remembered the night's move. I dove for his legs, tackling him with the force of 30 years of suppressed anger. We hit the muddy bank of the pond, rolling into the cold, shallow water. Wyatt was stronger, but I was desperate. I shoved his face into the silt, scrambling back toward the dry land. As I stood up, I saw something that made my heart stop. A third set of headlights was coming down the long dirt driveway of the farmhouse. Not the black SUV, not Miriam's car. These were the high-intensity LED lights of a tactical response unit. And then, my phone buzzed again. A new message. Endgame initiated. Sacrifice the rook. Protect the king. I looked at the silver key in my hand. The King's Row. It wasn't a location on the farm. It was a location in the city. And I realized then that the farmhouse, the passbook, and the diary were all just a distraction. They were the rook, the piece Grandpa was sacrificing to draw the enemies out into the open. The real treasure was somewhere else, and I was the only one with the key. The tactical units didn't move with the hesitation of local police. They moved like a tide of shadows, sweeping toward the farmhouse with a silent, terrifying precision. From the edge of the irrigation pond, I watched the strobe of blue and red lights begin to bounce off the white siding of the house. Wyatt was still gasping in the mud, clutching his throat, defeated by the silt and the shock of my resistance. I didn't help him. I couldn't afford the luxury of a sibling's mercy. I scrambled back into the cornstalks, retrieving the black diary from where I'd tossed it. It was damp but intact. I tucked it and the metal box into my waistband and began to move. Not toward the farmhouse, where Miriam was likely being detained or, worse, being collected by Vance, but toward the back perimeter fence that bordered the neighboring county road. The King's Row. I ran the phrase through my mind over and over. My grandfather's mind was a grid, a literal chessboard. In chess, the King's Row is the 8th rank, the place where a pawn is promoted to a queen. It is the end of the line. But in Columbus, Ohio, the King's Row was something much more literal and much more ignored. It was the nickname for a stretch of High Street that used to house the city's most prestigious banks and law firms in the 1920s, long before the steel skyscrapers took over. There was one building there that Eugene had mentioned once, years ago, when we were driving to a chess tournament. An old, narrow limestone structure with a gargoyle carved above the door. "That's where the real ledgers live, Danica," he had said, "in the dust where no one thinks to look." I reached the perimeter fence and climbed over, my hands stinging from the rusted wire. I walked for 20 minutes in the dark, until I reached a small 24-hour diner at a crossroads. I looked like a disaster, mud-stained, hair wild, smelling of pond water. I used the diner's payphone to call a local cab company. I didn't use the app. I didn't want a GPS trail. I told them I'd been in a minor fender bender and needed a lift into the city. The ride was an hour of agonizing tension. Every pair of headlights that appeared in the rearview mirror felt like Vance's SUV coming to reclaim me. Every siren in the distance felt like a closing net. I kept the black diary hidden under my coat, feeling the weight of the silver key against my skin. "You okay back there, lady?" the driver asked, eyeballing me in the mirror. "Fine," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Just a long night." "The city's crawling with feds tonight," he remarked, shaking his head. "Something's going down at the Heritage Plaza. They've blocked off 3 blocks. People are saying it's a cyber attack or some big money laundering bust." I felt a cold shiver. They were already ahead of me. They were hitting the digital hubs, trying to lock down the accounts. But they were looking for bits and bytes. They were looking for the Queen. They weren't looking for the King's Row. I had the driver drop me off 4 blocks away from the old limestone building. The air in downtown Columbus was sharp and carried the scent of rain. I walked with my head down, my baseball cap pulled low, blending into the early morning shadows of the city's janitors and night shift workers. I found the building. It was wedged between a modern glass office and a boarded-up theater. The gargoyle was there, its stone eyes staring down at the street with a cynical expression. The brass plate on the door read, "Gross and Associates, Archival Services." My breath hitched. Gross and Associates? My grandfather had never mentioned a firm in the city. He was a retired farm accountant. But as I pressed the silver key into the lock of the heavy oak door, it turned with a smooth, oiled click that suggested it was used far more often than the dust on the windows implied. The interior was a time capsule. Rows upon rows of floor-to-ceiling wooden filing cabinets filled the narrow space. The air was thick with the smell of cedar and old parchment. There were no computers, no servers, no humming cooling fans. This was a paper fortress. This was where the ghost ledger actually lived, not on a drive, but in physical ink that couldn't be hacked, deleted, or remotely wiped. I walked to the very back of the room, to the 8th row of cabinets, the King's Row. I found the drawer labeled 7741-Master. I pulled it open. Inside wasn't just a ledger. It was a series of folders, each one dedicated to a name I recognized from the evening news. Senators, corporate titans, and at the very front, a folder labeled Miriam and Wyatt. I opened it, and my heart shattered. It wasn't just evidence of their greed, it was a contract. My mother hadn't just been working for the consortium, she had been the one who proposed the liquidation of my grandfather's assets. She had signed an agreement 30 years ago to monitor him, to act as his jailer in exchange for a monthly stipend that had funded her life and Wyatt's education. They were his keepers, paid to wait for him to die so the secrets could be reclaimed. But Eugene knew. He had documented every payment they received. He had recorded every conversation where they discussed his deteriorating mind. He had turned his own family's betrayal into the final piece of evidence that would bring the whole system down. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered on. I spun around. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the streetlights, wasn't Vance. It wasn't Miriam. It was a man I hadn't seen in 20 years. He was older, grayer, but the sharp, analytical eyes were the same. He was wearing a dark trench coat and holding a manila envelope. "You're late, Danica," he said. "Your grandfather said you might be, but he hoped you'd have more of his punctuality." "Who are you?" I gasped, clutching the folder to my chest. "I'm the man who taught Eugene how to hide in plain sight," he said, stepping into the light. "I'm the lawyer who hasn't existed on paper since 1992. And if you want to stay alive for the next 20 minutes, we need to move these files. The bank was just the distraction. They're coming here next." "Vance?" "Vance is a child playing with matches," the man said, dismissing the federal agent with a wave of his hand. "The people who are coming now, they don't lock doors, they burn buildings." As if on cue, the sound of a heavy vehicle screeched to a halt outside. The windows of the office rattled. "Endgame," the man whispered. "Are you ready to sacrifice the pieces, Danica? Or are you going to try to save everyone?" I looked at the files of my mother and brother. I looked at the names of the powerful men who had built their lives on my grandfather's silence. I felt the silver key in my pocket, and I knew what I had to do. "I'm not saving anyone," I said, my voice cold. "I'm clearing the board." The man in the trench coat moved with a fluid, haunting speed that didn't match his age. He didn't wait for my permission. He began pulling specific folders from the King's Row cabinets, tossing them into a heavy, reinforced leather satchel. Outside, the sound of car doors slamming echoed like a sequence of gunshots. The limestone walls of the office felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. I looked at the folder in my hand, the one labeled with my mother's and brother's names, and felt a wave of nausea. My entire life had been a subsidized performance. Every birthday gift, every tuition check, every modest holiday had been funded by the very people my grandfather was dismantling. "Who are you really?" I demanded, even as I helped him shove documents into the bag. "My grandfather didn't have partners. He didn't trust anyone." "He didn't trust people," the man corrected, his voice a low rasp. "He trusted leverage. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I was the silent partner in Gross & Associates before it went underground. Your grandfather kept the books. I kept the exits clear. Now, grab the master ledger, the red one at the back of the drawer. That is the only thing that matters. Everything else in this room is a lure." I reached for the red ledger. It was heavy, bound in thick, pebbled leather that felt almost like skin. As my fingers closed around it, the front windows of the office exploded. Not from a bomb, but from a coordinated breach. 2 black flashbang canisters skittered across the hardwood floor, emitting a blinding white light and a sound that felt like it was trying to shake my brain loose from my skull. I hit the floor, my ears ringing with a high-pitched metallic whine. Through the haze of smoke and the spots dancing in my eyes, I saw shadows moving. They weren't agents in suits. They were tactical operators in gray fatigues, silent and efficient. They weren't here to talk. They were here to sanitize the site. "Behind the cabinet!" Penhaligon shouted, his voice muffled by the ringing in my ears. He grabbed my collar and yanked me into a narrow gap between the heavy oak filing units. He pulled a small glass vial from his pocket and smashed it against the floor of the aisle. Instantly, a thick chemical fog began to billow out, smelling of ozone and sulfur. It was a visual obscuring agent, thicker and more persistent than the smoke from the flashbangs. "They have thermal imaging," I hissed, my paralegal brain recalling a discovery motion I'd filed months ago regarding police surveillance. "Not for this," Penhaligon grunted. "This gas is chilled. It'll mask your heat signature for 90 seconds. Move. Toward the back wall. There's a freight lift disguised as a shelving unit." We crawled through the fog, the floor littered with broken glass and the debris of my grandfather's archives. I could hear the rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed weapons firing into the stacks. They were shredding the paper, destroying the physical evidence of their own crimes. They didn't care about the money anymore. They cared about the names. We reached the back wall. Penhaligon pressed a sequence of hidden buttons behind a row of empty ledgers, and a section of the wall groaned open. We tumbled into a cramped, dark lift that smelled of grease and old iron. As the door hissed shut, I heard a voice through the fog outside, a voice that made my blood run cold. "Search the King's Row," Vance commanded. His voice was no longer professional, it was frantic. "If the girl has the red ledger, don't worry about the noise. Take her out." The lift began to descend, a slow, agonizing crawl into the bowels of the building. I clutched the red ledger to my chest, the weight of it feeling like a literal heart. "They're going to burn it," I whispered. "The whole building. They'll claim it was an electrical fire. They'll erase everything." "Let them," Penhaligon said, checking the chamber of a compact pistol. Eugene knew they would. That's why the archives are rigged. The moment the temperature in that room hits 100 degrees, the sprinkler system doesn't drop water. It drops accelerant. By dawn, there won't be a scrap of paper left in this city that connects the consortium to the Gross family. "But then we lose the evidence," I cried. "How do we stop them if we have nothing?" Penhaligon looked at me, a grim smile touching his lips. "You really aren't paying attention to the board, Danica. The red ledger isn't evidence. It's a map of the digital backups hidden in the one place they can never touch. Your grandfather didn't just store data. He encoded it into the blockchain of the very companies they used to launder the money. To delete the evidence, they would have to delete their own fortunes." The lift hit the bottom with a jarring thud. We were in a service tunnel, damp and echoing, that led toward the city's sewer system. Penhaligon led the way, his flashlight cutting a thin, lonely path through the dark. "Where are we going?" "To the final rank," he said. "The end game requires a sacrifice. You have the ledger, but you need a broadcast point, a place where the signal can't be jammed. And I know just the spot." We emerged 20 minutes later in the basement of an abandoned radio station on the outskirts of the city. The air was stale, and the equipment was decades old. But as Penhaligon flipped a series of switches, a bank of modern servers hidden beneath the old consoles hummed to life. "This is it," he said, stepping aside. "The interface is set to your biometric scan. Your grandfather used your thumbprint and a retinal scan from the photos you took at the farmhouse. He knew you'd take them. He knew you wouldn't be able to resist documenting the crime." I sat at the terminal, my hands trembling. This was it. The moment the pawn reaches the end of the board. I opened the red ledger. On the first page, there was no list of names. There was only a single sentence. "To my granddaughter. The truth is a fire. Once lit, it cannot be controlled. Be sure you are ready to burn." I placed my thumb on the scanner. A blue light swept across my skin. The screen flickered, and a massive directory began to populate. Thousands of files, millions of transactions, the secret history of a shadow empire. But as I reached for the enter key to broadcast the data to every major news outlet and federal agency in the country, My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a video call. I answered it. The screen showed the interior of the farmhouse. Miriam and Wyatt were sitting at the kitchen table. They weren't being detained. They were tied to chairs, their faces bruised, their eyes wide with a terror that surpassed anything I'd seen on the porch. Standing behind them, holding a flare gun to a pile of gasoline-soaked rags, was Vance. "Hello, Danica," Vance said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I figured you'd find your way to the transmitter. You're very predictable. Now, we have a choice to make. You hit that send button, and I pull this trigger. Your mother and brother will burn with the farm. The gross legacy ends tonight, one way or another." He leaned into the camera, his eyes cold and empty. "What's it going to be, Danica? The truth? Or your blood?" I looked at the send button. I looked at my mother's sobbing face on the screen, the woman who had betrayed me, who had sold my grandfather's life for a stipend, and Wyatt, the brother who had tried to tackle me in the mud. "The truth is patient," I whispered, my finger hovering over the key. "Danica, don't!" Wyatt screamed through the phone. I looked at Penhaligon. He said nothing. He simply watched me, waiting to see what kind of player I really was. The silence in the abandoned radio station was deafening, broken only by the low, mechanical hum of the servers and the ragged breathing of Wyatt on the phone screen. On the monitor, Vance stood like an executioner, the flare gun steady in his hand, the smell of gasoline practically wafting through the speaker. This was the final trap, not a move on the board of logic, but a move on the board of the heart. My grandfather had prepared me for the numbers, the codes, and the secrets, but he had left the most agonizing decision to me. Was the truth worth the lives of the people who had spent their lives betraying me? "You have 30 seconds, Danica," Vance said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "I don't care about the money anymore. My employers have already moved their primary assets. This is about containment. If you broadcast that data, you aren't just a whistleblower. You're the person who murdered her only living family. How does that look in the headlines you're so eager to create?" I looked at Miriam. Her eyes were fixed on the camera, wide and bloodshot. She wasn't pleading for my help. She looked like she was finally seeing me for the first time. Not as a daughter, not as a disappointment, but as the only person who held the power of life and death over her. "Danica," Penhaligon whispered from the shadows behind me. "In chess, the king cannot be captured, but he can be forced into a position where every move leads to ruin. This is Zugzwang. If you move, you lose. If you stay still, you lose." "I don't believe in losing," I said, my voice cracking but firm. I looked back at the screen. "Vance, you're an auditor. You're a man of details. If you're as smart as you think you are, you've already realized something. My grandfather didn't leave me the ledger so I could hold it hostage. He left it to me because he knew I was the only one with the stomach to finish the game." I moved my hand, but not to the send button. I began typing a secondary command, a sequence of codes I had memorized from the black diary in the cornfield. "What are you doing?" Vance barked, stepping closer to the rags. "Stop typing." "I'm not sending the files to the press, Vance," I said, my fingers flying across the keys. "I'm sending a kill switch command to the Heritage Trust master server. You said your employers have moved their assets. They haven't. They've moved the pointers to their assets. The actual wealth is still sitting in the cryptographic loops my grandfather designed. If I hit this key, the money doesn't just go away. It gets redistributed." Vance paused. The greed that sat at the core of his soul began to fight with his orders. "Redistributed where?" "To the very agencies you're trying to avoid. To the victims of the consortium's liquidation projects. To the public treasury. And most importantly, it leaves a digital signature on every single one of your employer's private accounts. It turns their wealth into a beacon for every tax authority on the planet. You can burn the farm, Vance. You can kill my mother. But you'll be doing it for a group of people who won't be able to pay for your legal defense by sunrise." The flare gun trembled slightly in Vance's hand. He was calculating. He was a man who worked for power, and I was stripping that power away in real time. "You're bluffing," he hissed. "Am I? Check your phone, Vance. Check the internal secure comms for the consortium." Seconds passed. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like it would shatter the glass. On the screen, Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted device. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched the blood drain from his face, just as it had from the bank managers earlier that day. "The accounts are bleeding," he whispered, mostly to himself. "They aren't just bleeding, they're broadcasting," I said. "Every second you stand there with that flare gun is another $10 million mapped and logged by Interpol. You want to be a loyal soldier? Fine, burn the house, but you'll be the only one left to take the fall." Vance looked at Miriam, then at the camera. He was a predator who had just realized he was in a cage. He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't scream. He simply lowered the flare gun and turned, walking out of the camera's frame without a word. He was a professional to the end. He knew when the position was lost. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I slumped in the chair, my forehead resting on the cool edge of the keyboard. On the screen, I saw Miriam and Wyatt realize they weren't going to die. They didn't look relieved. They looked broken. "You saved them," Penhaligon said, stepping forward. "But you didn't send the files. The consortium is still out there. They're broke, but they're alive." "I didn't save them for their sake," I said, standing up and grabbing the red ledger. "I saved them because if they died, the story would end with them. I want them to live. I want them to have to explain to a grand jury how they spent 30 years being the jailers of a man who was 10 moves ahead of them the entire time." I turned back to the terminal. "And I didn't send the files to the press because the press can be bought. I sent them to a secure server at my law firm, addressed to the one senior partner I know can't be intimidated." "So, it's over?" "No," I said, looking at the silver key still clutched in my hand. "The endgame is just beginning. We've cleared the board of the pawns and the rooks. Now, it's time to go after the king." I walked out of the radio station, the dawn finally breaking over the Ohio horizon. The sky was no longer a bruised purple. It was a clear, piercing blue. I felt light, as if the weight of 30 years of family lies had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I had no car, my apartment was compromised, and my family was a wreckage of betrayal. But as I walked toward the main road, a black sedan pulled up. The window rolled down. It wasn't Vance. It was the bank manager, Mr. Henderson. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, but he wasn't shaking anymore. "Ms. Gross," he said, "I think you'd better get in. There are some people at the Treasury who would very much like to discuss the definition of a code black with you." I smiled. It was a sharp, focused smile, the kind Eugene Gross would have recognized. "Tell them I'll be there," I said. "But first, I need to make a phone call to my landlord. I have a feeling I'm going to be moving into a much better apartment very soon." The interior of the black sedan was quiet, smelling of leather and the faint ozone scent of high-end electronics. Mr. Henderson didn't speak as he drove me away from the skeletal remains of the radio station. He didn't have to. The silence was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. On the horizon, the sun was a fierce, golden orb, burning away the morning mist just as the truth was burning away the shadows of the Gross family history. I held the red ledger in my lap, its weight no longer a burden, but a foundation. "Where are we going, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, watching the Ohio landscape blur past. "I assume the Treasury doesn't hold meetings at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday." "We're going to a neutral site, Ms. Gross," he replied, his eyes fixed on the road. "Your grandfather was a man of infinite contingencies. He knew that if you succeeded, you would need a place to land. There is a small airfield north of the city. A private jet is waiting. Its flight plan is filed for Washington, D.C., but its destination is wherever you decide the final move should be made." I looked at the silver key one last time before tucking it into my pocket. Eugene Gross had spent 89 years preparing for a moment he would never see. He had lived in a drafty farmhouse, wearing threadbare flannel, so that I could sit in this car with the power to dismantle an empire. He had been the ultimate accountant, balancing a ledger of justice that had been in the red for half a century. 2 hours later, I was standing on the tarmac of a private airfield. The air was crisp, and the sky was an endless, mocking blue. A man in a charcoal suit, not Vance, but someone with the quiet authority of a true statesman, approached me. He didn't reach for the ledger. He simply nodded. Ms. Gross, my name is Director Miller. I believe you have something that belongs to the American people. Actually, Director, I said, stepping forward, I have something that belongs to the victims of the people you failed to catch for 30 years. I'm not just handing this over. I want a seat at the table. I want to see the indictments. I want to be the one who explains the position to the jury. Miller studied me for a long moment. He saw the mud on my shoes and the fire in my eyes. He saw the granddaughter of the man who had outplayed the world. I think that can be arranged, he said softly. Eugene always said you were the sharpest piece on the board. As I walked toward the steps of the plane, my phone buzzed one last time. It was a notification from the law firm's secure server. The transfer was complete. The evidence was out of my hands and in the hands of the law. But there was also a final, delayed email from my grandfather's private account, scheduled to send only when the master switch was flipped. I opened it. There were no codes, no instructions, just a single photograph. It was a picture of me, 7 years old, sitting on the farmhouse porch, frowning at a chessboard. My grandfather's hand was in the frame, gently pointing toward a knight. At the bottom of the email, it simply said, "Checkmate, Danica. The board is yours." I boarded the plane and took my seat. As the engines began to roar and the ground fell away, I looked down at the city of Columbus. Somewhere down there, Miriam and Wyatt were being processed into a life they never expected. Somewhere, Vance was running for a border that no longer existed for him. And somewhere, in a quiet farmhouse, a chessboard sat empty on a porch, waiting for a new game to begin. I am Danica Gross. I am 31 years old. I am a paralegal, an investigator, and a survivor. But more than that, I am my grandfather's final move. The truth is patient. It can wait longer than any lie, but when it finally arrives, it arrives with teeth. And I'm just getting started.